Maids eat in the kitchen. Those 4 words changed everything. They echo in my mind even now, years later, as I sit in the home that was always mine, eating from my grandmother's china, finally at peace. But to understand how I got here, you need to know what happened that night and every calculated move I made afterward. My name is Elena Vasquez, and for 3 years, I played the role of the perfect submissive wife. I cooked, I cleaned, I smiled when my mother-in-law, Margaret, criticized everything from my clothes to my accent to the way I folded towels. I bit my tongue when my husband, David, pretended not to notice. I told myself it was worth it, that love required sacrifice, that things would get better. I was wrong about so many things, but I was right about one. Things did get better, just not in the way any of them expected. Thank you for being here. This story isn't easy to tell, but knowing you're listening makes it easier. Stay with me until the end, and if you want, let me know where you're from in the comments. I'm curious how far these words will travel. The night everything shattered began with hope, which makes the memory even more painful. I had spent 2 full days preparing my grandmother's famous mole negro, a recipe passed down through 4 generations of women in my family. My abuela had taught me to make it when I was 12 years old, standing on a wooden stool in her tiny kitchen in Oaxaca, grinding chilies and chocolate together while she told me stories of our ancestors, of the women who had survived revolutions and poverty and heartbreak, all while keeping this recipe alive. She had passed away 3 months before that terrible dinner. The cancer had taken her quickly, mercifully in a way, but it had left a hole in my heart that nothing could fill. Making her mole was my way of honoring her memory, of keeping a piece of her alive in my new American home, of proving to myself that her legacy would not die with her. I had driven to 3 different specialty stores across the city to find the right dried chilies. The mulattos, the negros, the pasillas, each one essential to the complex flavor profile that made my grandmother's mole so special. I had toasted and ground the spices by hand, the way she taught me, refusing to use a blender because she always said the molcajete gave the sauce its soul. I spent hours adjusting the seasoning, tasting and adding, until it was perfect, until it tasted exactly like the mole she used to make for my grandfather every Sunday after church. David had promised me that this dinner would be different. His mother was coming over, and I wanted so badly to impress her, to finally break through the wall of coldness she had built around herself whenever I entered a room. I thought if she tasted my cooking, really tasted it, she might see me as more than the poor immigrant girl who had somehow tricked her precious son into marriage. I was so naive then, so desperate for acceptance from people who would never accept me. The table was set beautifully that evening. I had used the good china, the Wedgwood set with the delicate blue pattern that had been a wedding gift from David's aunt. The crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier light, catching the glow and scattering it across the room like tiny stars. I had arranged fresh flowers from the garden I had planted myself in the backyard, roses and dahlias in shades of deep red and orange that reminded me of my homeland. The mole was keeping warm on the stove in my grandmother's clay pot, the one she had brought with her when she first immigrated to America 40 years ago. That pot had traveled thousands of miles, had weathered decades of use, and now sat in my kitchen as a reminder of where I came from. The rice was perfectly fluffy, seasoned with tomatoes and garlic, and I had made fresh tortillas by hand because I wanted everything to be authentic. David came home from work at 6, distracted as usual, checking his phone constantly. His tie was loosened, his jacket draped over his arm, and he barely looked at me as he walked through the door. I attributed it to work stress at the investment firm where he worked as a senior analyst. I did not know then that the pressure was not from legitimate work, but from the desperate scrambling of a man trying to hide his crimes. "You look tired," I said, reaching up to straighten his collar. "Long day?" He pulled away from my touch, something he had been doing more and more lately. "Just busy. Is my mother here yet?" "Not yet. She should be here any minute. Everything is ready." "Good." He wandered toward the living room without another word, his phone already back in his hand. I watched him go, feeling the familiar ache in my chest that had become my constant companion. Something was wrong in our marriage, had been wrong for a long time, but every time I tried to address it, he dismissed my concerns as paranoia or insecurity. He made me feel like the problem was me, like I was imagining things. Margaret arrived at 7, exactly on time because she was never late and never early. Punctuality, she had once told me, was the mark of a civilized person. The implication being, of course, that people like me were not civilized. She walked into my home without knocking, as she always did, using the key David had given her over my objections. She was wearing one of her signature outfits, a cream-colored silk blouse that looked like it cost more than my entire wardrobe, tailored black pants that emphasized her slim figure, and a pearl necklace that sat perfectly against her collarbone. I would later learn that necklace had been purchased with money stolen from the company I secretly owned, but at that moment, I only saw its elegance and felt my own inadequacy. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, not a single strand out of place. Her makeup flawless in that understated way that spoke of expensive products and professional application. Her posture was ramrod straight, her chin lifted slightly, and she looked at me the way she always did, as if I were something unpleasant she had found on the bottom of her expensive Italian leather shoe. "Hello, Margaret," I said, my voice warm, despite the chill in her eyes. "I am so glad you could come. I made something special for dinner tonight." She did not respond to my greeting. She never did. Instead, she walked past me into the living room, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors as she surveyed every corner with a critical eye. I knew she was cataloging every imperfection, every speck of dust I might have missed, every item that was not quite up to her exacting standards. David emerged from the hallway, where he had been taking yet another phone call. He kissed his mother's cheek and helped her remove her coat, showing her the deference and attention that he never showed me. The contrast was painful to witness, as it always was. "David," Margaret said, her voice carrying that particular tone of disappointed authority that she had perfected over 63 years. "Why is there a smell coming from the kitchen? It smells like a Mexican restaurant in here." The words hit me like a slap, but I forced myself to smile. I had learned to smile through her insults, to pretend they did not hurt, to be the bigger person. "Mom," David said, and my heart lifted slightly at the note of warning in his voice. "Elena made dinner. She worked really hard on it." I felt hope flutter in my chest, fragile as a butterfly's wing. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe David would finally stand up for me, finally show his mother that I was his wife and deserved respect. That hope died quickly, as it always did. Margaret turned to look at me, her ice blue eyes narrowing with barely concealed contempt. "What did you make?" she asked, though her tone made it clear she did not actually care about the answer. "My grandmother's mole negro," I said, and I could hear the pride in my own voice, the love for my abuela bleeding through every word. "She passed away 3 months ago, and this was her signature dish. She taught me how to make it when I was a little girl. I thought it would be nice to share a piece of my heritage with the family." "Your heritage," Margaret repeated, making the words sound like something distasteful, something that should be hidden away rather than celebrated. How quaint, how very ethnic. I ignored the barb, as I had learned to ignore so many of her barbs over the years, and gestured toward the dining room. "Please, let us sit down. Dinner is ready." We took our seats at the table, David at the head because he always insisted on sitting at the head, Margaret to his right in the place of honor, and me to his left. I had placed my grandmother's mole in the center of the table in a beautiful ceramic serving dish that had also belonged to her, painted with bright flowers and birds. I had surrounded it with the rice and fresh tortillas, creating a spread that I thought was beautiful. Margaret looked at the table and said nothing. Her silence was somehow worse than any criticism she could have voiced, heavy with judgment and disdain. I served David first, as was expected, placing a generous portion of mole-covered chicken on his plate alongside the rice. He smiled at me, a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and for a moment, I let myself believe that everything was going to be okay. Then I reached for Margaret's plate to serve her as well. She pulled it away from me before I could touch it, yanking it across the table as if I had threatened her with a weapon. "What do you think you are doing?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I froze, my serving spoon suspended in midair. "I was going to serve you dinner," I said, confused by her vehemence. "I do not eat this kind of food," Margaret said, looking at my grandmother's mole as if I had presented her with garbage. "It is too spicy, too heavy, too ethnic. Do you not have anything normal? A salad, perhaps? Some grilled chicken without all of this sauce?" I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. "I made this specifically for tonight," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It is not too spicy, I promise. My grandmother's recipe is actually quite mild. Please, just try a bite." Thus, David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mom, maybe you could just try a little bit? Elena worked really hard on this." But there was no conviction in his voice. It was a suggestion, not a statement. A plea, not a demand. He was not defending me. He was negotiating with his mother. And Margaret heard the weakness in it just as clearly as I did. She pushed back her chair and stood up, her face twisted with disgust. "David, I need to speak with you in private." "Now." They retreated to the living room, leaving me alone at the dining table with my grandmother's mole growing cold. I could hear them talking in low voices, could hear the sharp edge of Margaret's tone even if I could not make out the words. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, staring at the food I had made with so much love. I thought about my grandmother, about how she would have handled this situation. She had faced discrimination her whole life. People who looked down on her for her accent, her skin color, her immigrant status. But she had never let them break her spirit. She had built an empire from nothing, starting with a single food cart and ending with a multinational corporation that employed thousands of people. I had promised myself I would be like her. But sitting at that table, alone and humiliated, I felt very far from the strong woman she had raised me to be. When they returned, something had changed in David's face. The softness was gone, replaced by something harder, something colder. He would not meet my eyes. Margaret walked directly to the table and stood over me, her shadow falling across my plate like a shroud. "I have spoken to my son," she said with dripping condescension. "You seem to have forgotten your place in this household." "My place?" I repeated, genuinely confused. This was my home. I was David's wife. "Yes, your place." Margaret's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You come from nothing. You are nothing. My son took pity on you, brought you into this family, gave you a home and a life you could never have achieved on your own. And how do you repay him? By serving this slop at our family dinner table? By expecting us to eat like peasants?" I looked at David, waiting for him to say something. Anything. He was staring at his hands, refusing to meet my eyes. "David," I whispered, "are you going to let her talk to me like this?" He finally looked up, but his eyes were empty, devoid of the love I had once believed I saw there. "Elena, maybe you should just apologize to my mother. You know how she feels about this kind of food. You should have made something else." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I had spent 2 days making this meal. I had told him about my grandmother, about what this recipe meant to me, about how I was still grieving her loss, and he was telling me to apologize for honoring her memory. I stood up, trembling. "No, I will not apologize. I made a beautiful meal to share with my family." Margaret's face went red with rage. "How dare you?" She grabbed my plate, the plate filled with my grandmother's mole, the plate that represented the hours of work and years of memory. "You need to learn your place. Maids eat in the kitchen." And then she threw the plate on the ground. The crash was deafening in the sudden silence. The ceramic shattered into 100 pieces, sending mole sauce splattering across the white tiles. Dark brown splashes decorated the baseboards, the chair legs, the hem of Margaret's expensive pants. My grandmother's recipe, my connection to my past, my offering of peace, lay destroyed at my feet. I stared at the mess, my vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall. The mole looked like blood on the white tiles, like the lifeblood of my heritage spilling out and being wasted. Then I looked at David. He was pale, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. He did not defend me. He did not tell his mother she had gone too far. He did not even look surprised, as if he had known this was coming, as if they had planned this humiliation together. When I continued to stand there, frozen in shock, he raised his hand and pointed at the door. His finger was steady. His face was blank. Maybe you should go cool off somewhere. Take a drive or something. Give everyone time to calm down. He was kicking me out of my own home. After his mother had destroyed my grandmother's memory, he was telling me to leave. I walked to the closet and grabbed my coat, moving mechanically. As I put it on, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a text message. I glanced at it, and something shifted inside me. The tears that had been threatening to fall suddenly dried up. The despair lifted, replaced by something else, something cold and sharp and infinitely patient. The message was from my lawyer, Jonathan Chen. The audit is complete. Ready when you are. I turned to face David and Margaret. They were standing together, united in their contempt for me. Margaret looked triumphant. David looked relieved. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally broken me. I smiled. It was not a warm smile or a sad smile. It was the smile of a woman who has just realized she holds all the cards and her opponents do not even know they are playing a game. I think I will take that drive, I said calmly. But David, you should check your work email tonight. I have a feeling there might be something important waiting for you. I walked out into the cool night air, feeling the breeze on my face like freedom. I got into my modest Honda Civic. Neither David nor his mother had ever questioned why a woman they believed came from nothing would drive such an unassuming vehicle. They had never questioned a lot of things about me. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the house David thought was his. The house I had purchased 3 months before our wedding, through a shell company. The house whose mortgage was paid by the same company that paid David's salary. The company that bore my grandmother's maiden name. The company they had been systematically robbing for 18 months. They had no idea. They thought I was a poor immigrant girl who had gotten lucky, who had married up. They did not know I had inherited my grandmother's business empire when I was 22. They did not know the investment firm where David worked was a subsidiary of my family's holdings. They did not know I had been watching them steal from me for over a year, documenting every transaction, every lie, every betrayal. I had given them enough rope to hang themselves. Tonight, with my grandmother's mole staining their pristine floors, I had finally decided to let them swing. I drove to my lawyer's office downtown, even though it was nearly 9 o'clock at night. Jonathan was waiting for me. "Mrs. Harrison," he said as I walked in, "or should I say, Ms. Vasquez?" I take it the dinner did not go well. I sat down and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with every word. When I finished, he pulled a thick folder from his drawer. David and his mother have embezzled approximately $2.3 million from Vasquez Holdings over the past 18 months. They have been funneling money through fake consulting contracts, all leading to accounts controlled by Margaret. $2.3 million. They were stealing from my grandmother's legacy, the business she had built from nothing. "What are our options?" I asked. "Criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. David would face significant prison time. Margaret could be charged as a co-conspirator. Not yet. I want to know how deep this goes first. I want to make sure there is no way for them to wriggle out of it." Jonathan nodded. "There is something else. David has been in contact with a divorce attorney for 6 months. They believe they can claim a significant portion of your assets, assuming the wealth was accumulated during the marriage." I almost laughed. They were planning to divorce me and take half of everything. not realizing that everything actually belonged to me from before we met. What else? Jonathan hesitated. There is a woman. David has been seeing someone for approximately 8 months. Her name is Cynthia Wells. She works at the firm. Of course, there was another woman. Of course, David's cruelty was not just about his mother's influence. He had someone waiting in the wings, someone he probably thought was more suitable than his embarrassing immigrant wife. I want everything, I said, my voice hard as steel. Every document, every email, every transaction. And Jonathan? Start preparing the criminal referral. When I am ready to move, I want to move fast. I drove to the apartment my grandmother had left me, a small sanctuary filled with her books and photographs and the faded scent of her perfume. I sat on her bed and finally let myself cry. Not for my marriage, not for David. I cried for my grandmother, for the mole that lay ruined on a cold kitchen floor, for the years I had wasted trying to be worthy of people who would never see my worth. When the tears were spent, I made chamomile tea and began to plan. David and Margaret thought they had broken me tonight. They thought smashing my plate had put me in my place. They did not understand they had not broken me. They had freed me. For 3 years, I had hidden my true identity because I wanted to believe David loved me for myself. Tonight, he had shown me who he really was. Now it was my turn to show them who I really was. My phone sat on the table, silent. I knew that by tomorrow it would explode with calls and messages. David would check his work email and find a notification about the audit. He would panic. 38 missed calls. That is what I would wake up to. 38 desperate attempts to reach me, to beg for mercy from the woman they had treated like a servant. But I would not answer. Not yet. I would let them sweat, let them imagine all the terrible possibilities. And when I was finally ready, I would answer. But not with words, with actions. I finished my tea and climbed into my grandmother's bed, pulling her quilt around me like a hug. Tomorrow would begin the real work. As I drifted off to sleep, I could almost hear her voice. Mi amor, you come from warriors. Never forget that. I did not forget, abuela, I whispered to the empty room, and I will make sure they never forget either. The next morning, my phone showed 38 missed calls, most from David, a few from Margaret, 2 from the firm's head of compliance. There were 17 text messages, ranging from confusion to panic to desperate pleas. I read them all slowly, savoring each word. The fear was palpable, the arrogance of the night before completely gone. I did not respond. Instead, I showered, dressed in my grandmother's silk robe, and made huevos rancheros with fresh salsa because I refused to let Margaret's cruelty take away my love of my own cuisine. As my phone continued buzzing with unanswered calls, I settled into my grandmother's apartment and began to wait. The game was just beginning, and I held all the cards. They just did not know it yet. The days that followed were an exercise in patience, something my grandmother had always tried to teach me, but that I had never truly mastered until now. Patience, mi amor, she used to say when I was a restless child, eager to see results immediately, is the weapon of the wise. Let your enemies think they are winning while you sharpen your blade in the shadows. The foolish attack in anger, but the wise wait for the perfect moment to strike. I did not return to the house that first night, or the second, or the third. I stayed in my grandmother's apartment, surrounded by her things, drawing strength from the memories that lived in every corner. Her rocking chair by the window, where she used to sit and watch the sunset, wrapped in her favorite shawl, the one with the bright colors that reminded her of home. Her collection of religious candles that she lit every Sunday morning while saying prayers for the family. The small altar in the corner where she kept photos of my grandfather and the children she had lost before me, the ones who never made it past infancy in those hard early years when she had nothing but hope and determination. I spent hours in that apartment, touching her things, remembering her voice, letting her presence fill me with the strength I needed for what was to come. Sometimes I would sit in her rocking chair and close my eyes, and I could almost feel her hands on my shoulders, her breath warm against my ear as she whispered words of encouragement. Each morning, I woke to more missed calls, more desperate texts, more voicemails that started angry and ended pleading. David's tone shifted day by day, from irritation to confusion to barely concealed panic. I saved every single one of them, adding them to the growing archive of evidence that Jonathan was compiling. Every word out of his mouth was another thread in the tapestry of his own destruction. "Where are you?" the first messages demanded, his voice sharp with annoyance. "You are being childish, Elena. Come home and apologize to my mother. She is very upset, and frankly, so am I. You embarrassed us both with your behavior. The least you can do is come back and make this right." Then, 2 days later, "Elena, this is not funny anymore. People at work are asking questions. Something is happening with the accounts. Something I do not understand. The compliance team wants to meet with me. Call me back. Whatever game you are playing, you need to stop it right now." And finally, on the 5th day, "Please, Elena, please call me back. I do not understand what is happening. The compliance department is asking for documents I cannot explain. They want to meet with me tomorrow, and I think they are going to suspend me. What do you know about this? Did you do something? Please, just tell me what is going on. I am begging you." I read each message carefully, analyzing his words for any hint of genuine remorse, any acknowledgement of how he had hurt me, any recognition that he might have done something wrong. I found none. He was not sorry for how he had treated me. He was not sorry for standing by while his mother destroyed my grandmother's memory. He was not sorry for the years of insults and dismissals and small cruelties that had eroded my sense of self piece by piece. He was sorry that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and he wanted me to help him hold it together. I had no intention of helping him with anything ever again. Jonathan kept me informed of the developments at the firm through daily phone calls and encrypted emails. We had set up a secure communication system months ago when I first began to suspect that something was wrong with the company's finances. At the time, I had hoped I was being paranoid that my husband was not the kind of man who would steal from his own family. But the evidence had been overwhelming, and now it was all coming to light. The compliance team started their investigation based on the anomalies we had flagged, and they were finding exactly what we knew they would find. Fake invoices from consulting companies that did not exist, companies with official-looking letterheads, and phone numbers that rang to disconnected lines. Wire transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, routing through multiple intermediaries to obscure the trail. Forged signatures on authorization documents, clumsy forgeries that would not have fooled anyone who bothered to look closely. The more they looked, the more they found, and the deeper David and Margaret sank into their own quicksand. The investigators are particularly interested in a series of payments to something called the Harrison Family Trust. Jonathan told me on the 2nd day, his voice tight with barely contained satisfaction. It appears Margaret set up the trust 5 years ago, shortly after David started working at the firm. Since then, David has been funneling company funds into it through a series of fake consulting contracts. The payments were disguised as fees for strategic advice, but the only strategy involved was stealing as much money as possible without getting caught. "How much?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. We had been tracking these payments for months, nearly $1.5 million just through that one channel. There are other accounts as well, other methods they used. The forensic accountants are still tracing everything, but the preliminary estimate is that the total theft could exceed $3 million. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest, a vindication that was as bitter as it was sweet. For years, Margaret had treated me like I was after her family's money. She had accused me of being a gold digger, of marrying David for his position and his prospects, of scheming to get my hands on the Harrison fortune. She had made snide comments about my heritage, suggested that people from my background could not be trusted with money. implied that I was one step away from stealing the silver. And all along, she had been the one stealing. She had been using her own son as the instrument of her theft, manipulating him into committing crimes that would destroy his career and possibly send him to prison. The hypocrisy was almost too perfect to believe. By the third day, Jonathan called with news that made me smile for the first time since the night of the dinner. They have brought in external investigators, he said, a team from one of the big 4 accounting firms. The board is taking this very seriously, Elena. They have suspended David pending the outcome of the investigation. They have frozen his access to all company systems and revoked his building credentials. He cannot even enter the building without an escort. Administrative leave. Such a polite corporate way of saying that his career was over, that everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers like sand. I thought about the smug expression on his face when he had pointed at the door and told me to leave our home. I wondered what expression he was wearing now. I wondered if he was finally beginning to understand that he had underestimated me, that he had mistaken my patience for weakness and my silence for submission. "What about Margaret?" I asked. Jonathan paused, and I could hear him shuffling papers on the other end of the line. "That is where things get interesting. She has started making calls, reaching out to lawyers, trying to move money between accounts. We have been monitoring her communications through the legal channels available to us, and she is scared, Elena. Very scared. She has called David 17 times in the past 24 hours, each call more panicked than the last. She is telling him to destroy documents, to wipe his computer, to claim that someone else must have accessed his accounts. She does not understand that it is already too late for any of that. Good. Let her be scared. I want her to feel the same fear she made me feel every time I walked into that house, every time she criticized my cooking or my clothes or the way I spoke English. I want her to lie awake at night wondering if tomorrow will be the day everything falls apart, the way I lay awake for years wondering if I would ever be good enough for her precious family. There is something else," Jonathan continued, his voice taking on a careful tone that told me I would not like what I was about to hear. "David and Cynthia Wells had lunch together yesterday. Based on what we have learned, it appears he is telling her everything, or at least his version of everything. He is positioning himself as a victim, saying that you are behind this somehow, that you are framing him out of jealousy and spite because you found out about their relationship. He is telling her that you are mentally unstable, that you have been planning this for months, that you are vindictive and dangerous." Of course he was. David had always been skilled at shifting blame, at making himself the hero of every story, at turning his failures into someone else's fault. Even now, with evidence piling up against him, with his career in ruins and his freedom in jeopardy, he was trying to find a way to make this my fault. It was almost impressive, his ability to rewrite reality to suit his narrative. If I had not been the target of his lies, I might have admired his commitment to the performance. "Let him talk," I said, my voice steady and cold. "The more he says, the more he incriminates himself. Every lie he tells Cynthia, every document he tries to destroy, every call he makes to his mother plotting their next move, it all becomes evidence. And when the time comes, I want Cynthia Wells to know exactly who she has been sleeping with. I want her to understand that the man she thought she loved is a thief, a liar, and a coward who let his mother abuse his wife for years without saying a word in her defense." I spent the next few days learning everything I could about my husband's mistress. Knowledge is power, my grandmother used to say, and I intended to have all the power in this situation. Cynthia Wells was 28 years old, 7 years younger than me, blonde and attractive in that polished corporate way that Margaret probably approved of. She had a degree from a respectable university and had been working in the marketing department for 3 years, climbing the ladder with suspicious speed thanks to David's patronage and influence. Her social media accounts painted a picture of a woman living far above her means. Photos from expensive restaurants where a single meal cost more than most people's weekly grocery bills. Designer handbags that retailed for thousands of dollars. Vacations in tropical locations, always staying at the best resorts, always flying first class. The lifestyle of a woman who was spending money she had not earned, money that came from my grandmother's company, money that David had stolen to impress his young mistress. I wondered how much of that lifestyle David had funded with money he stole from me. Looking at the photos of her smiling on beaches in the Maldives, wearing jewelry that cost more than most people make in a year, I felt a strange mixture of anger and pity. She thought she was living a fairy tale, falling in love with a handsome executive who would sweep her away from her ordinary life. She did not know that her fairy tale was built on lies and theft, that the foundation of her happiness was constructed from my grandmother's legacy and my own suffering. According to Jonathan's research, Cynthia believed she was in love with a successful executive who was trapped in an unhappy marriage with an unstable wife. David had told her that I was mentally ill, that I was controlling and emotionally abusive, that he was afraid to leave me because he did not know what I might do in retaliation. He had painted himself as a victim of domestic abuse, using my heritage and my temperament as evidence of my supposed volatility. He told her I was paranoid and jealous, that I flew into rages over small things, that I had threatened to destroy him if he ever tried to leave. The irony was not lost on me. The man who had stood silently while his mother destroyed my grandmother's memory, who had pointed at the door and kicked me out of my own home, who had spent 3 years watching his mother belittle and humiliate me without ever once speaking up in my defense, was telling his mistress that I was the abusive one. I saved every piece of information Jonathan gathered, every email David had sent to Cynthia, full of romantic promises and complaints about his terrible wife, every text message, including the explicit ones that made my stomach turn, every receipt for the gifts he had bought her with company funds, every hotel booking, every restaurant bill. When the time came, I wanted the picture to be complete. I wanted everyone to see exactly who David Harrison really was, beneath the polished exterior and the charming smile. On the 4th day, Margaret came to the apartment. I do not know how she found me. Perhaps David had hired someone to track my phone, or perhaps she had followed me at some point without my knowledge. Perhaps one of the building staff had been bribed to reveal my location. It did not matter. What mattered was that she was standing outside my grandmother's door, pounding on it with her fist like she had every right to be there, demanding that I let her in. "I know you are in there, Elena," she shouted through the door, her voice echoing in the hallway. "Open this door right now. We need to talk about what you have done." I sat on my grandmother's couch, sipping chamomile tea from my grandmother's favorite cup, listening to her rage. Part of me wanted to open the door, to confront her, to tell her exactly what I thought of her and everything she had done. I wanted to see her face when she realized that the maid she had despised was actually the one who held her fate in her hands. But the wiser part of me, the part that sounded like my grandmother's voice, told me to wait. Let her exhaust herself. Let her show her true colors to anyone who might be listening. "This is all your fault," Margaret continued, her voice cracking with desperation. "You did something to the accounts, did you not? You are trying to frame my son. I always knew you were trash, that you were not good enough for him, but I never thought you would stoop to this. You are a snake, Elena, a scheming, manipulative snake who has been plotting against this family from the beginning." I recorded every word on my phone, holding it up to the door to capture the audio as clearly as possible. Later, I would add it to the file of evidence we were building. Margaret's own voice, accusing me of crimes that she herself had committed, making threats and hurling insults at a closed door like a woman who had lost all control. It would make a compelling addition to the case. She pounded on the door for nearly an hour before finally giving up. I heard her heels clicking on the stairs as she left, heard her car start and pull away with a screech of tires. Only then did I allow myself to exhale, setting down my tea and leaning back on the couch. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother. She was standing in her kitchen in Oaxaca, grinding chiles in her molcajete, the way I had seen her do 1,000 times when I was a child. The kitchen was filled with the smell of roasting peppers and warm tortillas, the smells of my childhood, the smells of home. But when she looked up at me, her eyes were not the warm brown I remembered. They were hard as obsidian, sharp as the blade of the ancient Aztec warrior she used to tell me stories about. "They underestimate you, mi amor," she said in the dream, her voice echoing strangely, as if coming from very far away. Just as they underestimated me when I was young, when I was a poor girl, with nothing but dreams and determination. Let them underestimate you. It is their greatest weakness, and it will be your greatest strength. When the jaguar hunts, she does not roar to announce her presence. She waits in silence until her prey believes itself safe, and then she strikes. When I woke, I knew what I had to do next. I called Jonathan and told him I was ready to move forward with the next phase. He asked if I was sure, if I understood that there would be no going back once we started down this path. Once the prosecutors were involved, once the charges were filed, the machine of justice would begin to turn, and there would be no stopping it. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," I told him. "They wanted to put me in my place. Now I am going to show them exactly what my place is." The next morning, I returned to the house for the first time since that terrible dinner. I waited until I knew David would be at his meeting with the compliance investigators, the meeting that would likely determine whether the company would pursue criminal charges against him. I wanted the house to myself, wanted to walk through its rooms one last time before everything changed forever. I had not expected to feel anything as I walked through the front door. I had prepared myself for emptiness, for clinical detachment, for the cold satisfaction of reclaiming what was mine. But standing in the foyer where I had endured so many of Margaret's criticisms, where I had smiled through so much pain, where I had felt myself shrinking smaller and smaller under the weight of their contempt, I felt a wave of grief wash over me. Not for the marriage, which had been a lie from the beginning, not for David, who had never deserved my love or my loyalty, but for the woman I had been when I first walked through that door, the woman who had believed in love and family and the possibility of belonging, the woman who had thought that patience and kindness could change people, who had given everything to a man who had never deserved any of it. I walked through the living room, trailing my fingers over the furniture I had chosen, the art I had hung on the walls, the curtains I had picked out to catch the morning light. This had been my home, my sanctuary, the place where I had hoped to build a life and raise a family. And they had turned it into a prison, a place where I walked on eggshells and bit my tongue and apologized for existing. The kitchen still bore faint traces of that night. The tiles had been cleaned, of course, probably by the housekeeper whose salary I paid, but if you looked closely, you could see a slight discoloration where the mole had stained the grout, a permanent reminder of what had happened, of what they had done. I knelt down and traced the faded mark with my finger, remembering the crash of the plate, the triumphant sneer on Margaret's face, the empty look in David's eyes as he pointed at the door. "I am sorry, Abuela," I whispered. "I am sorry I let them treat your memory that way. But I promise you, they will pay for every insult, every cruelty, every moment they made me feel like I was worth less than the dirt on their shoes." As I was making my last trip through the house, gathering the few belongings that truly mattered to me, I heard the front door open. For a moment I froze, my heart racing, wondering if David had come home early. "Hello? Is someone here?" It was Cynthia Wells. I stepped into the living room to find her standing in the foyer, looking around with wide eyes like she owned the place. She was dressed for the office in a sleek pencil skirt and silk blouse, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. The picture of professional success, built on stolen money and lies. When she saw me, her expression shifted from confusion to something harder, something uglier. "You must be Elena," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "David has told me so much about you." "I am sure he has," I replied calmly, crossing my arms and meeting her gaze without flinching. She took a step closer, trying to project confidence, trying to establish dominance in what she clearly believed was her territory now. "Look," she said, "I think we should talk, woman to woman. David has told me about your problems, about the way you have been manipulating him. I just want you to know that I'm not your enemy. I want to help you get the help you need." I stared at her for a long moment, taking in the careful concern in her eyes, the practiced sympathy in her voice. She believed every word David had told her. She believed she was the hero of this story, the good woman who would save the handsome executive from his crazy wife. "Tell me," I said, "when David bought you that necklace you are wearing, the one from Cartier, did he tell you where the money came from?" She touched the necklace instinctively, her fingers brushing against the diamonds. "That is none of your business." "Actually, it is very much my business, because that necklace was purchased with money stolen from a company called Vasquez Holdings, a company that I own, which means technically you are wearing stolen property." Cynthia's face went pale, but she rallied quickly. "That is a lie. David would never do something like that. You are just trying to manipulate the situation, just like he said you would." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder, one of the many Jonathan had prepared for me. I opened it and held up a page for her to see. "This is the receipt for that necklace. Paid for with a company credit card that David was not authorized to use. The invoice was filed under consulting expenses, but I think we both know there was no consulting involved." Before she could respond, the front door opened again. David stood in the doorway, his face ashen. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here? What have you told her?" I smiled at him, the same cold smile I had given him the night of the dinner. "I have not told her anything she did not deserve to know. But do not worry, David. Soon, everyone will know the truth about who you really are." I walked past him and out the door, leaving them standing in the foyer of the house that had never truly been theirs. As I got into my car and drove away, I could see them in the rearview mirror, already arguing, their perfect facade crumbling around them. That evening, Jonathan called with the update I had been waiting for. "The investigators are recommending that the company pursue criminal charges," he said. "The board has accepted their recommendation. The prosecutors will be notified tomorrow." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we wait for the prosecutors to review the evidence and decide whether to file charges. Based on what we have given them, I expect they will move quickly. This is a clear-cut case of embezzlement and fraud." My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Elena, please. We need to talk. I can explain everything. I know I made mistakes, but we can work this out. I love you. Please give me a chance to make this right." I read his words, searching for any trace of sincerity, but all I saw was desperation. I deleted the message without responding. The game was far from over, but I had made my first move, and I had no intention of losing. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in watching someone destroy themselves. I observed from a safe distance as David and Margaret scrambled to save what was left of their crumbling empire, making mistake after mistake, each one digging their hole a little deeper. It was almost poetic, watching the same arrogance that had made them treat me like dirt now blind them to the reality of their situation. They were so accustomed to being in control, to having their way in everything, that they could not adapt when the ground shifted beneath their feet. Margaret moved into the house a week after the investigation began, claiming she wanted to support her son during this difficult time. She showed up with 3 suitcases and a sense of entitlement that filled every room she entered. In reality, I knew from Jonathan's reports, she was there to coordinate their defense and to try to find a way to hide what remained of the money they had stolen. She had already moved $500,000 to an account in her sister's name, thinking that would protect it from seizure. She had also transferred the titles of 2 cars into her brother's name and sold her jewelry collection to a private buyer for cash. She did not know that we had been tracking every transaction she made, that every attempt to hide assets only added to the evidence against her. She also took it upon herself to redecorate my home, as if erasing my presence could somehow erase the evidence of what she and David had done. Jonathan sent me photos every few days, documenting the changes she was making. Each one made my blood boil, but I forced myself to remain calm to see the bigger picture. My grandmother's ceramic serving dish, the one painted with flowers and birds by the artist in her village, had been thrown in the trash. My carefully chosen curtains, the ones I had spent weeks selecting to catch the morning light just right, had been replaced with heavy drapes in Margaret's preferred style, dark and oppressive. The garden I had planted with my own hands, the roses and dahlias that reminded me of Mexico, had been ripped out and replaced with a lawn services generic landscaping, all neat green grass and nothing that required actual care or attention. Room by room, she was erasing every trace of my existence, as if by removing my things, she could remove me from David's life entirely. She replaced my books with her own. She threw away my photographs. She even had the audacity to take down the small altar I had set up in the corner of the bedroom, the one where I kept my grandmother's picture and a candle that I lit every morning in her memory. I saved the photos to my evidence folder, carefully documenting each change with dates and descriptions. They would be useful later, when we demonstrated the contempt with which the Harrison family had treated me and my belongings. They would help paint a picture, for the jury, of who these people really were beneath their polished exteriors. But the most infuriating development came 2 weeks after the investigation began, when David called a family meeting to announce that he had a plan to save them all. Jonathan's sources had been present at that meeting, disguised as house staff, and they had recorded everything. I listened to the recording 3 times before I could believe what I was hearing. The plan, Jonathan explained to me over the phone after I had processed the initial shock, is to have you declared mentally incompetent. They have hired a psychiatrist, a Dr. Franklin Peters, who has a reputation for providing favorable diagnoses to wealthy clients. He has testified in dozens of cases, always on behalf of people who can afford his fees, and his conclusions always seem to support whatever his clients need them to support. I felt my jaw tighten as Jonathan continued. The idea is to claim that you manipulated the company records yourself, that you are suffering from some sort of delusional disorder that caused you to frame your own husband for crimes that you actually committed. They plan to argue that your obsession with your grandmother's death has caused a psychotic break, that you have created an elaborate fantasy in which David and Margaret are the villains and you are the victim. If they can get you declared mentally incompetent, they believe they can have the investigation halted and the evidence thrown out as the product of a disturbed mind. I laughed out loud when I heard this, a bitter sound that echoed in my grandmother's empty apartment. It was such a perfectly David solution, such a perfect example of his belief that he could talk his way out of anything, that the rules did not apply to people like him. He was going to try to have me committed to avoid going to prison. He was going to use my grief for my grandmother, the grief he had never once acknowledged or comforted, as evidence of my supposed insanity. How far along are they with this plan? I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the rage churning in my stomach. They have already contacted Dr. Peters. David has met with him twice, feeding him stories about your behavior, your paranoia, your supposed obsession with his mother. He has told the doctor that you have been exhibiting signs of mental illness for years, that you have delusions of grandeur, that you believe yourself to be the secret owner of a major corporation despite having no evidence to support this claim. Jonathan paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. Margaret has been corroborating everything, he continued. She has given the doctor a statement claiming that she has been concerned about your mental state since the day you married David. She says you have always been erratic and emotional, that you fly into rages over small things, that you have accused her of crimes she did not commit simply because of your irrational hatred of her. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar cold anger settle in my chest like a stone. The anger that had become my constant companion since the night of the dinner, the anger that I had learned to channel rather than suppress. They were going to try to destroy me by claiming I was crazy. The same people who had made me feel crazy for years, who had gaslit me into believing that their cruelty was somehow my fault, who had dismissed every legitimate grievance I raised as evidence of my instability, were now going to use my supposed mental illness as a defense against their own crimes. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. "What do we do?" I asked Jonathan, my voice calm and controlled despite everything I was feeling inside. "We let them proceed," he said, and I could hear the calculating tone in his voice, the lawyer's mind at work. "We let them pay this psychiatrist to write his report. We let them submit it to the court. We let them build their entire defense around the premise that you are mentally incompetent, and then we destroy it. How? By presenting our own evidence. By showing the court that you are the legal owner of Vasquez Holdings, that you have been successfully running a multinational corporation for years without any sign of mental illness. By presenting the testimony of your own doctors who have been treating you for nothing more serious than the occasional cold. By calling your employees, your business associates, the board members who have worked with you for years, all of whom will testify that you are one of the most competent and level-headed executives they have ever known." He paused, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "And by presenting the audit trail that shows David and Margaret have been stealing from your company for 18 months. It is hard to claim that someone framed you when the evidence shows your own handwriting on the forged documents, your own login credentials accessing the accounts, your own bank accounts receiving the transferred funds. It is even harder when the supposed crazy person has documentation going back over a year, showing that she has been methodically gathering evidence while appearing to be the perfect, submissive wife." I nodded, even though he could not see me. Then we let them proceed. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day brought new developments, new outrages, new reasons to want to storm into that house and confront them both. But I held back, as my grandmother had taught me, letting them believe they were winning while I sharpened my blade in the shadows. Patience, she used to say, is not the same as passivity. It is a choice to wait for the right moment rather than acting on impulse and giving your enemy the advantage. David grew more confident as the days passed, interpreting my silence as surrender. His messages to me shifted again, from desperate pleas to cold demands. He wanted me to come home and sign some papers. Documents that would transfer assets he did not know belonged to me. He wanted me to meet with his psychiatrist for an evaluation, to give Dr. Peters the opportunity to observe my supposed instability firsthand. He wanted me to stop being difficult and accept that our marriage was over, but that we could still end things amicably if I would just cooperate. His definition of amicably, I soon learned, involved me signing away all my rights to what he believed were our shared assets, admitting to fabricating the evidence against him, and checking myself into a psychiatric facility for an extended evaluation. In return, he would graciously not press charges against me for whatever imaginary crimes he was planning to accuse me of. I forwarded every message to Jonathan without responding. Each one would be useful later, demonstrating David's attempts to coerce and manipulate me, his willingness to abuse the mental health system to avoid accountability for his actions. Meanwhile, Margaret was settling into my home like she had always lived there, which in her mind she probably believed she should have. She threw away my clothes to make room in the closet for her own extensive wardrobe. She brought over her furniture to replace the pieces I had chosen with such care. She even had the audacity to host a dinner party for her society friends, sitting at the head of my table, eating off my grandmother's remaining china, telling everyone who would listen about her poor son and his unstable immigrant wife who had tried to destroy him out of jealousy and spite. Jonathan's people attended that dinner party undercover, posing as caterers. They recorded everything, including a particularly damning conversation in which Margaret laughed about how easy it had been to manipulate the naive Mexican girl who thought she could marry into their family. The breaking point came 3 weeks after the investigation began, when Margaret announced her intention to sell the house. She filed the paperwork with a real estate agent without consulting David, without consulting me, without any legal right to sell a property that was not hers. She simply decided that she needed the money to pay for their mounting legal defense, and she assumed that her son's pathetic wife would have no objection, that I would meekly accept whatever she decided, just as I had accepted everything else over the past 3 years. She did not know that the house was in my name. She did not know that I had purchased it 3 months before the wedding through a shell company called Luna Properties, using money from my grandmother's estate. She did not know that every document she signed with the real estate agent was worthless, because she had no authority to sell property she did not own. But I let her proceed. I wanted to see how far she would go, how deep she would dig herself into this particular hole. I let her schedule the open houses, watching from across the street as strangers walked through my home, commenting on the decor that Margaret had chosen. I let her accept an offer from a buyer, a wealthy couple who had no idea they were being defrauded. I let her get all the way to the closing table before I made my move. Jonathan served her with the cease and desist order on the day of the closing in front of the buyer, the buyer's lawyer, the real estate agent, and half a dozen witnesses. The document explained in detail that the house was owned by Luna Properties, a subsidiary of Vasquez Holdings, and that Margaret Harrison had no legal authority to sell, transfer, or otherwise dispose of the property. Any attempt to proceed with the sale would constitute fraud. The look on her face, Jonathan told me later, was priceless. She went from confused to outraged to terrified in the span of about 30 seconds, as she realized that she had just tried to commit fraud in front of a room full of people who would all be required to give statements to the police. The buyer backed out immediately, threatening to sue Margaret for wasting their time and for the emotional distress of nearly purchasing a property they had no legal right to. The real estate agent dropped Margaret as a client and filed a complaint with the state licensing board. And the story spread through Margaret's social circle like wildfire, destroying the carefully constructed narrative she had been building about her poor, persecuted family. But that was not the worst of it for them. The worst came when David found out what his mother had tried to do. He called me that night, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "Elena, what have you done? My mother is in hysterics. The closing fell through. She is saying something about the house not being ours. That cannot be right. We bought this house together, before the wedding. It is in my name. I have the deed." "Actually," I said, speaking to him directly for the first time in weeks, my voice calm and even, "it is in my name. I bought it 3 months before we were married, through a company called Luna Properties." Luna was my grandmother's nickname, the name her friends used to call her because of her love of moonlit walks. "I thought you might have recognized it from the mortgage payments that come out of your company's accounts every month." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, so long that I wondered if he had hung up. I let it stretch out, savoring the moment, imagining the look on his face as 3 years of assumptions crumbled around him. "That is impossible," David finally said, but there was no conviction in his voice, only confusion, and the first stirrings of genuine fear. "If you owned the house, why would you let me believe it was mine? Why would you let me think I was providing for you?" "Because I wanted to see what kind of man I had married," I said simply. "I wanted to give you a chance to prove that you loved me for myself, not for what you thought I could give you. And you failed, David. You failed every single test I set for you. You let your mother treat me like garbage. You stole from my company to buy gifts for your mistress. You cheated on me while I was sleeping in the next room. And you were so confident in your superiority, so certain that a poor immigrant girl could never be smarter than you, that you never once questioned how I could afford such an expensive house." I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, heavy and ragged, like a man who has just been punched in the stomach and is struggling to fill his lungs with air. "What else?" he whispered. his voice breaking. What else do you own that I do not know about? Everything, I said, and I felt a dark satisfaction in finally being able to say the words out loud. I own everything, David. The investment company you work for. The one where you thought you were such an important senior analyst. The house you have been living in. The one your mother is currently redecorating with my money. The car you drive to work every morning. The bank accounts you have been draining to buy jewelry for Cynthia Wells. All of it belongs to me. It always has. My grandmother built an empire from nothing, and she left it all to me when she died. I am the anonymous investor who saved your failing company 3 years ago. I am the one who signs your paychecks. There was another long silence, and then David did something I had never heard him do before in all the years I had known him. He started to cry. I wish I could say that I felt some satisfaction in that moment, some triumph at finally breaking through his arrogance and forcing him to confront the truth of who he had married. But I did not. I felt only a profound emptiness, a grief for the life I had thought we were building together, a mourning for the man I had believed David could be, if only I loved him enough. Why, he asked through his tears, his voice cracking like a child's. Why did you do this to me? I thought about all the ways I could answer that question. I could tell him about the years of insults I had endured. I could tell him about the nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering what I had done wrong. I could tell him about my grandmother's shattered plate, about the mold that had stained the kitchen floor, about the moment he had pointed at the door and told me to leave. But in the end, I said only this, because you showed me who you really were, and I believed you. I hung up the phone and did not answer when he called back. The next morning, Margaret was arrested at the house she had been trying to sell. The attempted sale had given the prosecutors exactly what they needed to add additional charges to the case. Fraud, attempted theft, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, providing false statements to a real estate agent. Combined with the embezzlement charges that were already pending, Margaret was looking at serious prison time. David was arrested that afternoon, at the house that he now knew had never been his. He was still in his pajamas when the police arrived, having not slept at all after our conversation the night before. The images were all over the news that evening, the handsome executive being led out in handcuffs, his face blank with shock. Margaret had already made bail by then and was waiting at the police station to post bond for her son. They emerged together, surrounded by lawyers and reporters, refusing to answer questions. I watched the coverage from my grandmother's apartment, eating tamales that I had made from her recipe. The mole I had not been brave enough to attempt again, not yet, but the tamales felt like a small victory. Jonathan called as the news coverage was winding down. They have been formally charged, he said. The arraignment is scheduled for next week, and based on the evidence, the prosecutor is recommending that bail be revoked and both defendants be held pending trial. What are our next steps? Now we wait for the trial. In the meantime, I suggest we file for divorce. Given the circumstances, I do not anticipate David will contest it. I thought about the divorce papers. It felt strange to reduce 3 years of my life to a legal document, but there was no point in delaying. File the papers, I said. And Jonathan? Make sure the divorce petition includes a full accounting of all the assets I brought into the marriage. I wanted on record that David Harrison left this marriage with exactly what he came into it with, which was nothing. He came into this marriage with nothing, and he will leave it the same way. After I hung up, I sat in the darkening apartment, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. The trial would be long and difficult. There would be testimony and cross-examination, media attention, and public scrutiny. David and Margaret would fight back with everything they had because that was what people like them did when they were cornered. They would hire the best lawyers their stolen money could buy. They would lie and manipulate and try to paint themselves as the victims. But they had already lost, even if they did not know it yet. They had lost the moment they underestimated me. the moment they decided that a woman who ate her grandmother's mole was not worthy of sitting at their table. They had looked at me and seen only what they expected to see, a poor immigrant girl who should be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness they threw her way. They had never bothered to look deeper, to question their assumptions, to consider the possibility that I might be more than what I appeared. That blindness would be their downfall. That arrogance would be their undoing. And when they finally opened their eyes and saw the truth, it would be far too late to save themselves. They had called me a maid. Now they would learn what it felt like to serve. I picked up my phone. It was time to make one more call. "Hello, Cynthia," I said. "I think it is time we had that talk. Woman to woman. How about lunch tomorrow?" There was a surprised pause. "I would like that. I think there are some things we need to discuss." "Yes," I agreed. "I think there are. I had one more card to play, and Cynthia Wells was going to help me play it, whether she wanted to or not. The restaurant where I met Cynthia Wells was expensive, elegant, and carefully chosen for its discretion. Private booths with thick velvet curtains that could be drawn for complete privacy, waiters who knew when to appear and when to disappear like ghosts, and enough ambient noise from the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers to cover any conversation that did not want to be overheard. It was the kind of place where power brokers made deals and where secrets were traded like currency. The kind of place where fortunes changed hands over a bottle of wine and a handshake. It seemed fitting for what I had in mind. I arrived early, as I always did for important meetings, and spent the time reviewing my notes and watching the door. The folder of evidence sat beside me on the leather seat, thick with documents that would shatter whatever illusions Cynthia still harbored about the man she thought she loved. I had spent the previous night organizing it all, making sure that every piece was in the right order, that the story it told was clear and undeniable. Cynthia arrived 15 minutes late, which I suspected was deliberate. A power play, an attempt to establish dominance before the conversation even began, to make me feel like I had been waiting for her attention and approval. She was wearing a tight red dress that showed off her figure, the kind of dress designed to make every man in the room look twice and every woman feel inadequate. Designer heels that added 4 inches to her height, making her tower over the hostess who led her to my table. And of course, the Cartier necklace that had been purchased with money stolen from my company, glittering against her pale skin like a badge of her supposed triumph. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in loose waves that probably took an hour to achieve. Her makeup flawless in that way that took real skill to look effortless. And she walked toward my table with the confident stride of a woman who believed she was about to win a battle. She had probably spent the morning preparing for this confrontation, rehearsing what she would say, imagining all the ways she would put the crazy wife in her place. She had no idea what she was walking into. "Elena," she said, sliding into the booth across from me with a practiced smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I must say, I was surprised when you called. After our last conversation, I did not think you would want to speak to me again. I assumed you would be too busy licking your wounds." I returned her smile with one of my own, equally practiced, equally false, but with an edge of knowing that made her confidence falter for just a moment. "I thought about what you said," I replied, "about us having a woman-to-woman talk. I decided you were right. There are things we need to discuss, things that will determine how the next few months and possibly years of your life unfold." She blinked at that, a tiny crack in her composure, but she recovered quickly. Always the professional, always in control. Or so she believed. The waiter appeared with menus bound in leather and gold leaf, and we made a show of studying them while sizing each other up across the table. I could see Cynthia trying to read me, trying to figure out my angle, trying to determine whether I was here to beg for mercy or to threaten her. She was smart, I had to give her that. Not as smart as she thought she was, but smart enough to know that this meeting was not what it appeared to be, that there were currents running beneath the surface that she could not quite see. After we ordered, with Cynthia choosing the most expensive items on the menu in what I assumed was another power play, a petty attempt to cost me money and establish her superiority. She leaned back in her seat and fixed me with what she probably thought was a penetrating gaze. The look of a woman who had already won and was just waiting for her opponent to admit defeat. "So," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "why did you really call me here? And please, do not insult my intelligence by pretending you want to be friends. I know you hate me. I know you blame me for your failed marriage. But David never loved you, Elena. He told me that himself many times. You were just a mistake he was too polite to correct." "I do not hate you," I said, and it was true. What I felt for Cynthia was closer to pity than hatred, the kind of sorrow one feels for someone who has been deceived without knowing it. You are a victim in this, just like I was. David lied to both of us. He used both of us for his own purposes. The only difference is that I found out the truth sooner, and I had the resources to do something about it. Cynthia's perfectly shaped eyebrow arched upward, her lips twisting into a condescending smile. "A victim? Is that what you think I am? Darling, I am not a victim. I am the woman David loves. I am the woman he is going to marry once he is free of you. You are the one who should be pitied, clinging to a man who never wanted you in the first place." I did not let her words sting me. They were designed to hurt, to make me defensive, to give her the upper hand in this conversation. But I knew something she did not. I knew that everything she believed about David, about their relationship, about their future together, was built on lies. And I was about to tear it all down. "I think you are a woman who fell in love with a man who told her exactly what she wanted to hear," I said, keeping my voice calm and even. "I think David saw something in you that he could use, some vulnerability or desire, some dream of the life you wanted, and he exploited it ruthlessly. He told you I was crazy, that I was dangerous, that I was making his life miserable. He told you our marriage was over, that it had been over for years. He told you that as soon as he could get free of me, you would be together forever, living the life you both deserved. Am I close?" Cynthia's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she recovered her composure. "Even if that were true, which it is not, what does it matter now? David and I love each other. We have plans, a future. Once this ridiculous legal mess is sorted out, once your little scheme is exposed for what it is, we are going to be together. He promised me. He chose me." I leaned forward across the table, lowering my voice to force her to lean in as well, creating an intimacy that felt almost conspiratorial. "Cynthia, how much has David actually told you about his current legal situation? Not the story he wants you to believe, but the actual facts of the case?" She hesitated, her fingers playing nervously with the stem of her wineglass. "I know he is facing some charges. Something about financial irregularities at the company. But his lawyers say it is all a misunderstanding, that someone manipulated the records and set him up. That you set him up because you found out about us and wanted revenge. That is what this is really about, is it not? You want to destroy him because he chose me over you. And you believe that? You believe that a woman who barely finished college, a poor immigrant girl from Mexico, somehow managed to fabricate millions of dollars worth of financial fraud, create fake companies and offshore accounts, forge David's signature on hundreds of documents, all without anyone noticing until now? Does that really seem plausible to you?" I could see her thinking, trying to reconcile the story David had told her with the obvious problems in his narrative. She was not stupid, this woman. She had just allowed herself to be blinded by what she wanted to believe. I pulled a folder from my purse and laid it on the table between us, the leather binder landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet booth. The same folder I had shown her at the house, but thicker now, filled with additional evidence that had emerged since then, documents that painted a picture so complete and so damning that no reasonable person could look at them and conclude anything other than the obvious truth. "This," I said, pushing it toward her across the white tablecloth, "is the truth about the man you love. Everything in this folder is documented and verified by forensic accountants, reviewed by lawyers, and accepted by prosecutors as evidence in a criminal case. Bank records showing wire transfers to accounts David controlled. Invoices for consulting services from companies that do not exist. Documents with forged signatures that have been traced back to David's computer. All of it traced back to David and his mother. They stole over $3 million from my company, Cynthia. And some of that money, a significant amount of it, was spent on you. Cynthia stared at the folder, but did not touch it, as if she believed that by refusing to open it, she could make its contents not real. I already know about the necklace, she said, her voice becoming defensive, losing some of its earlier confidence. David explained that to me. He said the expense reports were filed incorrectly, that it was a simple accounting error. These things happen in business. Did he also explain the hotel rooms in Paris and Rome and Milan? The first-class flights that you took together while telling everyone you were visiting clients? The apartment in the city that he has been paying for with company funds for the past 8 months? I opened the folder and spread several pages across the table, arranging them so she could see each one clearly. Here is the lease for that apartment, signed by a shell company that David created specifically to hide the payments. Here are the credit card statements showing purchases at your favorite stores, your favorite restaurants, all charged to accounts that trace back to the company. Here are the wire transfers to your personal bank account, disguised as consulting fees for services you never provided. David has been paying your rent for the past 8 months, Cynthia, funding your entire lifestyle, and every penny of it was stolen from me. Cynthia's face went pale as she looked at the documents spread before her, the color draining from her cheeks until she looked almost gray. I could see her mind working furiously, trying to find an explanation, some way to reconcile what she was seeing with what David had told her, some alternative interpretation that would preserve the fantasy she had been living. But there was no explanation. The evidence was too clear, too comprehensive, too damning to explain away. "This cannot be right," she whispered, her voice losing all its earlier strength. "David said his wife, that you, were behind all of this. He said you fabricated the evidence because you found out about us and wanted revenge. He said you were dangerous, that you were capable of anything." I laughed, a genuine laugh this time, tinged with sadness for the woman sitting across from me, who was just now beginning to understand how thoroughly she had been deceived. "Cynthia, if I wanted revenge, do you think I would need to fabricate anything? David has been stealing from me for 18 months, and I have documentation going back over a year proving every single theft, every fake invoice, every wire transfer, every forged signature, every shell company. I did not create this evidence. David created it himself every time he stole another dollar from my company. All I did was collect it and organize it." Cynthia was silent for a long moment, staring at the papers spread across the table as if they were a puzzle she could not solve. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her mascara threatening to run if she allowed herself to blink. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice small and lost, nothing like the confident woman who had walked in 15 minutes ago. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand who David really is, beneath the charm and the lies and the promises. And I want you to help me make sure he never does this to anyone else." "Help you how?" I leaned back in my seat, giving her space to process what I was about to say. "The prosecutors are building their case, but there are gaps in the evidence. Things that only someone close to David would know. I need a witness who can testify to his state of mind, his intentions, his knowledge of what he was doing. I need someone who can confirm that he knew the money was stolen and that he used it anyway, that he was not some innocent dupe manipulated by others." Cynthia's eyes widened with understanding and fear. "You want me to testify against him? I want you to tell the truth. That is all. You have been receiving stolen money, Cynthia. Whether you knew it or not, that makes you complicit in a crime. The prosecutors can charge you as an accessory after the fact, seize everything David gave you, freeze your bank accounts, and potentially send you to prison. Or you can cooperate, tell them what you know, and walk away from this with your freedom and your reputation intact. The waiter approached with our food, and we both fell silent, waiting for him to arrange the plates and refill our water glasses before disappearing again. When he was gone, Cynthia still had not spoken, her face a mass of conflicting emotions. "If I cooperate," she finally said, her voice barely audible, "what happens to David? He faces the consequences of his actions. Nothing more, nothing less. The evidence against him is overwhelming, Cynthia. With or without your testimony, he is going to prison. The only question is whether you go with him or whether you walk away from this with something still intact." She was quiet for a very long time, staring at the documents, at her untouched food, at anything except my face. I watched her without speaking, giving her the space to make her decision. This was the moment that would determine everything. Finally, she looked up at me. "He never loved me, did he?" she asked, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "It was all about the money, about using me to spend the money he could not spend openly. I was just a convenient tool. I do not think David is capable of loving anyone except himself," I said gently. "He loved what you represented to him. The status, the youth, the validation. But love? Real love? I do not think he knows what that means." Cynthia nodded slowly. "I will do it. I will cooperate with the prosecutors." I felt relief wash over me. "Thank you, Cynthia." She wiped her tears impatiently. "You know what the worst part is? He talked about you constantly, about how difficult you were, how demanding, and I believed him. But you are not terrible, are you? You are just someone he used, just like me." I reached across the table and touched her hand. We were both fools. The difference is that I had resources to fight back. You did not have that option. Something shifted in her expression, a softening of the hostility. "What do you need me to do?" I spent the next hour walking her through what the prosecutors would need. She had more information than I had hoped. David had been careless around her, confident that his mistress would never betray him. Before she left, Cynthia paused. "Can I ask you something? That night at the house, you could have destroyed me. Why did you not? Because you did not throw a plate at my feet and call me a maid. You are not the person who hurt me. David is. His mother is. You are just someone who got caught up in their lies." Cynthia nodded, tears glistening. "Thank you for being kinder than I deserved." I stayed at the restaurant for another hour after Cynthia left, nursing a glass of wine and watching the city lights come on outside the window. The trap was nearly complete now. David's mistress had become his accuser. The woman he had trusted with his secrets had become the witness who would help seal his fate. Another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Another step closer to the justice my grandmother deserved. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The years of enduring insults and dismissals. The nights I had cried myself to sleep, wondering what I had done wrong, wondering why I was never good enough for the family I had married into. The slow, painful realization that the man I loved had never loved me back, that our entire marriage had been built on lies and exploitation. And I thought about my grandmother, about the woman who had taught me that strength does not always look like fighting back. Sometimes strength looks like patience. Sometimes strength looks like waiting for the right moment, gathering your resources, positioning your pieces on the board until you are ready to make your move. She had built an empire from nothing, and she had done it by being smarter and more patient than everyone who underestimated her. Now, I was doing the same thing. My phone buzzed with a text from Jonathan. The prosecutor accepted the meeting. Cynthia Wells is scheduled to give her statement on Monday morning. Based on what you told me about your conversation, this could be the break we have been waiting for. I smiled as I read the message, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle over me. Another piece clicking into place, another domino set to fall. When I got home that night, I did something I had not done since the night of the dinner. I went to the kitchen, opened the cabinet where I had stored my grandmother's things, and pulled out her molka. The ancient stone-grinding bowl felt heavy in my hands, worn smooth by generations of use, still carrying faint traces of the spices that had been ground in it over the decades. I ran my fingers over its rough surface, feeling the weight of history and tradition in every groove and hollow. This was more than just a cooking tool. It was a connection to my past, to my heritage, to the women who had come before me. My grandmother had used this molcajete. Her mother had used it, and her mother before that, all the way back to a time when our ancestors had ground chiles and spices for the ancient recipes that had been passed down through the generations. Margaret had tried to take this from me. She had thrown my grandmother's plate on the floor and screamed that maids belong in the kitchen. She had tried to make me feel ashamed of who I was, of where I came from, of the food and traditions that connected me to my roots. But she had failed. She had failed because you cannot take away someone's identity by destroying a plate. You cannot erase a culture by mocking its food. And you cannot break a woman who comes from a long line of women who refuse to be broken. Tomorrow, I decided I would go to the specialty stores and gather the ingredients for mole negro, the mulattoes and negros and pasillas, the chocolate and the spices, everything I would need to recreate my grandmother's recipe. The dish that Margaret had destroyed, but could never truly take from me. It was time to cook again. It was time to reclaim what they had tried to steal. "Sleep well, abuela," I whispered to the empty room, still cradling the molcajete in my hands. "We are almost there. And when this is over, I am going to make your mole again. I am going to fill my home with the smell of it, and I am going to eat it at my table, in my house, surrounded by people who love and respect me. The people who tried to take that from me are going to pay for what they did. I promise you that." I placed the molcajete carefully back in its place and went to bed, sleeping more peacefully than I had in months. The next morning, I woke to news that would set the final phase of my plan in motion. Jonathan called before I had even finished my coffee, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "They have made a move," he said. "David and Margaret have fired their lawyers and brought in a new legal team, a firm called Blackwood and Associates. They are known for their aggressive tactics, their willingness to play dirty, their complete lack of ethical boundaries. They have successfully defended some of the worst white-collar criminals in the country by destroying witnesses and burying opponents in frivolous lawsuits." I felt my heart rate increase slightly, but I kept my voice calm. "What are they planning?" "They have scheduled a press conference for this afternoon. David is going to make a public statement. According to our sources, he is planning to go on the offensive. He is going to accuse you of being the mastermind behind all of this, of fabricating evidence and framing him because you found out about Cynthia and wanted revenge." "Let him talk," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "Elena, this could get very ugly very fast. He is going to say terrible things about you. He is going to attack your character, your mental stability, your family. He is going to try to destroy your reputation in the court of public opinion before this case ever gets to a real courtroom." "I know. That is exactly what I am counting on." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You want him to do this?" Jonathan said slowly, realization dawning in his voice. "You have been waiting for him to do exactly this." "David has always been his own worst enemy," I explained. "He cannot help himself. When he feels cornered, when he feels like he is losing control, he attacks. He lashes out. He says things that he cannot take back, makes accusations that he cannot prove. And this time, when he attacks me publicly, when he accuses me of crimes I did not commit on live television, I am going to be ready with the truth." "What truth?" I smiled into the phone, feeling the same cold satisfaction I had felt the night of the dinner, when I had walked out the door with Jonathan's text message burning in my pocket. "All of it," I said. "Every document, every email, every wire transfer. The testimony from Cynthia Wells, the forensic analysis of the forged signatures, the surveillance footage of Margaret trying to sell my house, the recordings of her banging on my door and calling me a scheming snake. I am going to release it all, Jonathan. Not to the court, but to the media. Let David have his press conference. Let him stand in front of the cameras and tell his lies. And then let the whole world see the truth about who the real criminals are. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, and then he laughed, a sound of genuine admiration. You have been planning this from the very beginning, have you not? This whole time, you have been setting them up for this exact moment. Not from the very beginning, I admitted. At the beginning, all I wanted was for my husband to love me and for his mother to accept me. But when they showed me who they really were, when they made it clear that I would never be anything more than a servant to them, I started planning. I started preparing. And now we are ready. I hung up the phone and went to take a shower, preparing myself for the day ahead. By tonight, the whole world would know the truth about David and Margaret Harrison. By tonight, their carefully constructed facade would lie in ruins, just like my grandmother's mole on that kitchen floor. The press conference was scheduled for 4 o'clock. I had 8 hours to prepare. 8 hours to gather my evidence, contact my media contacts, and position myself for the final confrontation. Justice was coming, and I was going to be the one to deliver it. The press conference was held in the lobby of the Harrison family's lawyers' building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered. The building screamed wealth and power, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers and artwork that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. David had chosen the location carefully, wanting to project an image of wealth and legitimacy, wanting to remind everyone watching that he was a respectable businessman from a respectable family who had been wrongly accused by a vindictive immigrant wife. I watched from across the street, sitting in the back of a hired car, with tinted windows that kept me invisible to the crowd of reporters gathering at the building's entrance. Jonathan was beside me, his laptop open, monitoring the social media feeds and news channels that were covering the event live. The anticipation in the car was palpable, electric. This was the moment we had been building toward for weeks, the climax of a carefully orchestrated plan that would finally expose David and Margaret for who they really were. We had people inside the press conference too, members of our legal team who would be watching David's every word, noting every lie, preparing our response. They would text us updates in real time, letting us know exactly what David was saying so we could time our counterattack perfectly. The cameras were already rolling when David stepped up to the podium, taking his position in front of a backdrop emblazoned with the law firm's logo. He was wearing his best suit, a charcoal gray number that probably cost more than most people make in a month, perfectly tailored to his frame. His hair was professionally styled, not a strand out of place, and his jaw was set in an expression of righteous determination that he had probably practiced in front of a mirror. He looked like a man who had been wronged and was finally going to set the record straight, a victim of circumstance who was ready to fight for his good name. Margaret stood behind him, flanked by their new legal team, a phalanx of expensive suits that represented the best defense money could buy. She was dressed in black from head to toe, like a widow in mourning, her expression carefully arranged to suggest suffering and dignity in the face of persecution. The performance was flawless, every detail choreographed for maximum sympathy. If I did not know what they had done, if I had not lived through their cruelty, I might have believed they were the victims they were pretending to be. "Thank you all for coming," David began, his voice steady and commanding, the voice of a man used to being in charge, used to being believed. "I have asked you here today because I can no longer remain silent in the face of the lies and accusations that have been leveled against me and my family. For too long, I have stayed quiet, trusting that the truth would come out, that the legal system would vindicate me. But I have learned that silence can be mistaken for guilt, and I will not allow my reputation to be destroyed without a fight." He paused, letting the dramatic tension build, letting the cameras capture his look of pained determination. He was good at this, I had to admit. He had always been good at performing, at showing people exactly what they wanted to see. You have all heard the charges against me, David continued. Embezzlement, fraud, theft. These accusations have destroyed my career, ruined my reputation, cost me my position at a firm I helped build. They have torn my family apart and left my mother, an innocent woman who has never done anything wrong in her life, facing criminal charges. And they are all completely false. Every single accusation is a lie, fabricated by someone who wants to see me destroyed. I felt my jaw tighten as I watched him deliver the lie so smoothly, so convincingly. He had always been good at lying. It was one of his greatest talents, perhaps his only real talent. He could look you in the eye and tell you that black was white, and he would do it with such confidence that you would start to doubt your own vision. The truth, David continued, leaning into the microphone for emphasis, is that I am the victim of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy, perpetrated by my own wife. Elena Vasquez is not the innocent victim she claims to be. She is a manipulative, vindictive, dangerous woman who has been planning my destruction for years, perhaps from the very moment she first targeted me for marriage. He looked directly into the cameras, his expression shifting to something that might have been sorrow if you did not know it was manufactured. When I married Elena, I believed she loved me. I believed we were building a life together, a future, a family. I welcomed her into my home, introduced her to my friends, gave her every opportunity to become part of my world. But I was wrong. Elena never loved me. She married me to gain access to my family's connections, to the investment firm where I worked, to the wealth and status that she could never have achieved on her own. And when our marriage began to fail, when I made the mistake of seeking comfort elsewhere, she decided that if she could not have me, no one would. I heard Jonathan snort beside me. Seeking comfort elsewhere. That is one way to describe an 8-month affair with your secretary while your wife was grieving her grandmother's death. David was warming to his subject now, his voice rising with righteous anger that he had clearly practiced until it sounded genuine. The evidence that has been presented against me was fabricated from the beginning. Every document, every bank record, every so-called proof of my guilt, it was all created by Elena and her team of lawyers and accountants. She has access to sophisticated financial software through her family's business interests that she concealed from me throughout our marriage. She has the resources to hire hackers, to forge documents, to create fake paper trails that lead nowhere. And she has the motive. A woman scorned. A woman whose pride was wounded when I fell in love with someone else. She would rather see me in prison than admit that our marriage failed because of her own shortcomings. He slammed his fist on the podium for emphasis, the sound echoing through the marble lobby. I am innocent. My mother is innocent. We are the victims of a woman who could not accept that she was never good enough for this family, who would destroy us all rather than face the truth about herself. I felt the anger rise in my chest, hot and sharp, threatening to overwhelm the cold calculation that had gotten me this far. A real wife, never good enough, as if I had not spent 3 years cooking and cleaning and enduring his mother's cruelty, trying to be exactly what they wanted me to be. As if I had not given everything I had to a marriage that he had been sabotaging from the beginning. But I kept my expression neutral, forced my breathing to stay steady. The time for anger would come later. Right now, I needed to watch and wait. I needed to let David talk himself into a corner before I sprung the trap. David continued for another 15 minutes, spinning an elaborate tale of conspiracy and persecution that grew more outlandish with every sentence. According to his version of events, I had planted the evidence against him months before the investigation began, manipulating company records and creating fake documents in anticipation of the moment when I would need to destroy him. I had manipulated the compliance team, turning them against him through lies and bribes. I had turned his own mistress against him through threats and intimidation, forcing Cynthia to lie about their relationship. He painted himself as an innocent man caught in a web of lies, destroyed by a wife who was both brilliant enough to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar fraud and crazy enough to do it for revenge. When he finally finished, he opened the floor to questions. The reporters were skeptical but polite, asking about the specific evidence, about how exactly a woman with no technical background could have fabricated millions of dollars worth of financial fraud without anyone noticing until now. David had answers for everything, smooth and practiced, clearly rehearsed with his new legal team over days of preparation. "My wife has hidden depths," he said in response to one question. "She comes from a family with extensive business experience in Mexico. She has access to resources and expertise that I was never aware of. She is not the simple woman she pretended to be." The irony of that statement almost made me laugh out loud. He had no idea how right he was. But there was one question he was not prepared for. "Mr. Harrison?" a reporter in the back called out, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "We have received documentation suggesting that you are not actually the legal owner of your family home, that it was purchased by a shell company owned by your wife before your marriage. The deed shows the purchase was made by Luna Properties 3 months before your wedding. Can you comment on that?" David's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks so quickly that I could see it even through the car's tinted windows. His confident mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the fear underneath before he struggled to recover. "That is completely false," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty, had taken on a slightly desperate edge. "I do not know where you received that information, but it is clearly part of my wife's campaign of lies and misinformation. We have the deed," the reporter pressed, refusing to back down. "We have the records from Luna Properties, showing the purchase date and the corporate ownership structure. We have confirmed that Luna Properties is a subsidiary of a company called Vasquez Holdings, which has been in your wife's family for decades. Your wife owns that house, Mr. Harrison. She has always owned it. The mortgage payments have been coming out of accounts at the company where you worked, a company that is itself a subsidiary of her family's holdings. Can you explain that?" David opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He looked at his lawyers, at his mother, searching for help that was not coming. Margaret's face had gone as pale as her son's, her carefully maintained composure cracking as she realized the implications of what the reporter was saying. The silence stretched on, becoming more damaging with every second that passed, the cameras capturing every moment of their frozen panic. "This press conference is over," one of the lawyers finally said, stepping forward to shield David from the cameras, to try to salvage what he could from the disaster. "We will not dignify these baseless accusations with a response. My client will be vindicated in court, but the damage was done." I could see it in the faces of the reporters, in the way they were already typing furiously on their phones, spreading the story of David's frozen moment of panic, his inability to explain why he did not own the house he had claimed was his. The narrative was shifting right before our eyes, the carefully constructed story of David's innocence collapsing under the weight of a question he could not answer. "Now," Jonathan said beside me, his fingers flying over his laptop keyboard. "Now, we release everything." The next few hours were a controlled explosion of information, a carefully coordinated release of evidence that would demolish every lie David had told. Jonathan had prepared for this moment for weeks, assembling a comprehensive dossier that told the complete story of the Harrison family's crimes. We sent it to every major news outlet simultaneously, timed to hit just as David's disastrous press conference was becoming the biggest story of the day. Along with the documents, we released a statement from me, my first public words since the investigation began, explaining my side of the story in simple, clear language that anyone could understand. The documents told the truth that David had tried to bury. The fake invoices, with David's handwriting clearly visible on the approvals. The wire transfers to offshore accounts, traced through multiple intermediaries, but all leading back to Margaret Harrison. The testimony from Cynthia Wells, describing in detail how David had used stolen money to fund their affair, how he had bragged about the expensive gifts and vacations that he was buying with money that was not his. The forensic analysis proving that the forged signatures on the authorization documents had been created on David's personal computer, using software that only he had access to. And then there was the house. The deed showing that Luna Properties had purchased it 3 months before my wedding. The corporate records linking Luna Properties to Vasquez Holdings. The decades of tax returns and business filings proving that my grandmother had built this company from nothing. The proof that I was not the poor immigrant girl David thought he had married, but the sole heir to a fortune he had never known existed. The media coverage shifted within hours, the narrative turning on a dime as the truth came out. The morning headlines had been cautious, presenting David's claims alongside questions about the evidence, giving him the benefit of the doubt that wealthy white men always seem to receive. By evening, the headlines were brutal, unforgiving, final. Embezzlement, suspect's wife reveals. He never owned the house. He claimed was his mistress. Turns witness, senior analyst used stolen funds for affair. Mother and son face new charges after failed attempt to sell home. They did not own secret heiress. The woman David Harrison underestimated. I watched the coverage from my grandmother's apartment, eating tamales and drinking wine and feeling, for the first time in months, like I could finally breathe. The lies were crumbling. The truth was coming out. And David and Margaret were finally being seen for who they really were, not as respectable members of society, but as the thieves and bullies they had always been. My phone rang. It was Jonathan. The prosecutors have filed additional charges, he said, his voice tight with satisfaction. Perjury, for David's statements at the press conference. Every lie he told is now a separate criminal charge. Witness tampering, for his attempts to intimidate Cynthia before she agreed to cooperate. And they have revoked bail for both of them. They are being taken into custody tonight. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of something that was not quite satisfaction. It was more like relief. The release of a pressure that had been building for so long, I had forgotten it was there. The weight of carrying this secret, of pretending to be less than I was, of waiting for the right moment to strike, it was finally lifting from my shoulders. Thank you, Jonathan, for everything you have done. Do not thank me yet, he cautioned. We still have the trial. It is going to be long and difficult. They are going to fight back with everything they have. Their lawyers are already planning their next move. I know. But the truth is out now. No matter what they say, no matter what lies they tell, everyone knows who they really are. That is worth more than any verdict. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my grandmother's apartment and let myself feel everything I had been holding back. The anger and the grief. The betrayal and the vindication. The strange mixture of triumph and loss that comes from winning a battle you never wanted to fight. I thought about David, being led away in handcuffs for the second time, his carefully constructed life in ruins around him. I thought about Margaret, her social standing destroyed, her precious reputation in tatters, facing the prospect of years in prison. I thought about all the things they had taken from me, all the ways they had tried to make me feel small and worthless and less than human. And I thought about my grandmother, who had faced worse discrimination and worse cruelty in her life, and who had never let it break her spirit. She had built an empire from nothing, starting with a single food cart and ending with a multinational corporation. She had raised me to be strong and patient and smart, and she had given me the resources to fight back when the time came. I wish you were here, Abuela, I whispered to the empty room. I wish you could see that I did not let them win. The next morning, the judge revoked David and Margaret's bail and ordered them held without bond until trial. The flight risk, the judge said, was too great. The evidence of ongoing attempts to hide assets and intimidate witnesses was too damning. They would spend the next 3 months in jail, waiting for their day in court. I watched the footage of them being led into the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and cameras. David's face was blank, shell-shocked, like a man who still could not believe what was happening to him. Margaret was crying, her perfect makeup running down her cheeks in dark streaks, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of reality. For a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. They had brought this on themselves, but they were still human beings. They were still going to suffer. But then I remembered the crash of my grandmother's plate hitting the floor. I remembered the mole splattered across the white tiles like blood. I remembered David's finger pointing at the door, telling me to leave my own home. The pity faded, replaced by something harder, something that felt more like steel than flesh. They had made their choices. They had chosen cruelty over kindness, theft over honesty, arrogance over humility. And now they would live with the consequences of those choices every single day, for as long as the law decided they should. The trial date was set for 3 months from now. The evidence was compiled and organized, ready to be presented to a jury of their peers. The witnesses were prepared to testify. Everything was in place for the final act of this drama, the public reckoning that would determine their fate once and for all. But I found that I was no longer consumed by the trial, no longer obsessing over every detail of the case. The hardest part was over. The truth had come out. The world had seen who David and Margaret really were, and there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. Whatever happened in the courtroom, whatever verdict the jury returned, that truth would remain. They would never be able to pretend they were innocent again. I got up from my grandmother's couch and went to the kitchen, opening the cabinet where I had stored her things all these weeks. I pulled out her molcaje, feeling its familiar weight in my hands, and set it on the counter with a gentle thud that seemed to echo through the quiet apartment. Then I gathered the ingredients I had bought the day before, arranging them on the counter in the order I would need them. The dried chilies, the chocolate, the spices that my grandmother had used, that her mother had used, that generations of women in my family had used to create this sacred dish. It was time to make mole negro again. Time to fill my grandmother's apartment with the smells of my heritage, the aromas that Margaret had tried to make me ashamed of. Time to cook the dish that had been passed down through 4 generations, the dish that connected me to my past and to my people. I worked through the night, losing myself in the familiar rhythms of the recipe, toasting the chilies until they released their fragrance, grinding them in the molcajete, feeling the muscles in my arms burn with the effort, just as my grandmother's muscles had burned, just as her mother's had before her, adding the chocolate and the spices, tasting and adjusting, until the flavor was exactly right, exactly as I remembered it from my childhood. As the rich aroma filled the kitchen, I felt something shift inside me, something profound and final. The anger was still there, would always be there to some extent, a scar that would never completely fade. But it was different now. It was colder, more controlled, something that felt more like justice than revenge. I was not destroying David and Margaret because I hated them, although I did hate them, in a way. I was destroying them because they needed to be destroyed, because people like them should not be allowed to hurt others without consequences. And because I could. Because my grandmother had given me the power to fight back, and I had used it. When the mole was finished, I ladled it into a ceramic bowl, a new one I had bought to replace the one Margaret had destroyed. It was not the same, would never be the same, but that was all right. Some things could not be replaced. Some losses were permanent. But the recipe remained, unchanged and unchangeable, connecting me to everyone who had made it before me. I sat down at my grandmother's small kitchen table as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. The apartment was quiet and still, filled with the smell of mole and the memories of the woman who had lived here, who had built an empire from nothing, who had taught me everything I knew about strength and patience and love. I picked up my spoon and took my first bite of mole since that terrible night. The flavor exploded across my tongue, rich and complex, exactly as I remembered it, exactly as my grandmother used to make it, exactly as it had always been and always would be. Tears streamed down my face as I ate, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of completion, of closure, of a circle finally coming round to its end. I had honored my grandmother's memory. I had protected her legacy. I had shown them all that the woman they had dismissed as a maid, the woman they had called trash and told to eat in the kitchen, was stronger and smarter and more powerful than they had ever imagined. They had called me a maid. They had told me to eat in the kitchen. They had tried to make me feel ashamed of who I was and where I came from. But the table was mine. The house was mine. The company was mine. It had always been mine. And now, everyone knew it. I finished my mole and washed the dishes, placing my grandmother's bowl carefully back in its place. Then I went to the window and watched the sun rise over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange. A new day was beginning. A new chapter of my life was opening before me, and I was ready to write it. 6 months later, I stood at the window of my grandmother's apartment, watching the sun set over the city in ribbons of gold and crimson, painting the buildings with the kind of light that makes everything look like it belongs in a photograph. The glass was cool against my forehead as I leaned forward, my breath fogging a small circle on the pane, and I thought about how much had changed since that terrible night when Margaret had smashed my plate and David had pointed at the door. The world outside looked the same as it always had, the same cars moving through the same streets, the same pigeons gathering on the same rooftops, the same city going about its business without any awareness of how completely my life had transformed. But I was different. Everything was different. In my hand, I held the final letter from the court, the one confirming that all appeals had been denied and all sentences had been finalized. The paper was crisp and official, covered in legal language and formal stamps. But what it really represented was something far simpler than all those complicated words suggested. Justice, closure, victory. The trial had ended 2 weeks ago, after 3 months of testimony and cross-examination, of lawyers arguing and witnesses testifying, of David and Margaret trying every trick they could think of to escape the consequences of their actions. I had attended every single day, sitting in the gallery with my back straight and my expression neutral, watching as the prosecution laid out the evidence I had helped them gather. The courtroom had become a kind of theater, and every day brought new revelations, new witnesses, new pieces of the puzzle that I had spent so long assembling. David and Margaret had hired the best defense team their remaining money could buy, attorneys whose hourly rates could have fed a family for months. They had attacked my character, calling witnesses who claimed I was unstable, manipulative, prone to fits of rage and paranoia. They had questioned my mental stability, presenting the testimony of Dr. Peters, the psychiatrist they had hired to declare me incompetent. They had even attacked my family, suggesting that the Vasquez business empire was built on corruption and that I had learned my scheming ways from my grandmother herself. They had tried to paint me as a vindictive schemer who had fabricated evidence and manipulated witnesses, a woman scorned who would destroy an innocent man rather than accept that her marriage had failed. Their lawyers had spun elaborate theories about how I had planted documents, manipulated computer records, and somehow convinced multiple independent witnesses to lie on my behalf. They had suggested that Cynthia Wells was my puppet, that the compliance team had been bribed, that even Jonathan was complicit in some vast conspiracy to frame an innocent family. None of it had worked. The jury had deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning their verdict. I remember sitting in Jonathan's office that afternoon, watching the news coverage on his television while he worked at his desk, pretending to review documents, but really just keeping me company while we waited for word. When his phone rang with the news that the jury had reached a decision, we looked at each other in silence for a long moment, neither of us quite able to speak. Then we drove to the courthouse together, neither of us saying much, the anticipation building with every mile. guilty on all counts. The words echoed through the courtroom like a bell tolling, like a door slamming shut, like the final punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. David Harrison was convicted of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. Margaret Harrison was convicted of the same charges, plus attempted fraud for her attempt to sell the house that was not hers. The foreman read each count in a clear, steady voice, and with each guilty verdict, I felt another weight lift from my shoulders. The evidence had been overwhelming, the witnesses credible, the paper trail undeniable. Not even the most expensive lawyers in the city could argue their way around the truth. I watched Margaret's face as each verdict was announced. Watched the way her expression shifted from confident certainty to dawning horror as she realized that her money and her connections and her social standing meant nothing in this room. She had spent her whole life believing that people like her were above consequences, that the rules that applied to ordinary people did not apply to her. Now she was learning that the law does not care about your pearls or your club memberships or your dinner parties with the right people. The law only cares about what you did, and what they did was steal from me and then try to destroy me when I fought back. The sentencing hearing had been held last week. I had attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom where David and Margaret could not see me, wrapped in a coat and wearing sunglasses, despite the indoor setting. I wanted to be invisible, wanted to watch without being watched, wanted to witness their fall without becoming part of the spectacle. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses, and the kind of face that suggested she had seen every trick defendants could try and was not impressed by any of them. She spoke for nearly an hour before pronouncing the sentences, reviewing the evidence and explaining her reasoning in meticulous detail. She talked about the breach of trust, about the exploitation of a family relationship, about the particular cruelty of stealing from a grieving widow while pretending to be her loving husband. She talked about Margaret's role as the mastermind, about how she had manipulated her son and used his affair as leverage to involve him in her schemes. She talked about their lack of remorse, their continued attempts to blame the victim, their transparent efforts to hide assets and obstruct justice even after they had been caught. David received 12 years in federal prison. Margaret received 8. Neither of them would be eligible for parole for at least half their sentence. When the judge finished speaking, the room was silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that follows something irrevocable, something that cannot be taken back or undone. When the sentences were announced, David had turned around and scanned the courtroom, searching for me with desperate eyes. I do not know what he was hoping to see. Remorse, perhaps. Or forgiveness. Or maybe he just wanted to look at the woman who had destroyed him, to try one last time to understand how it had all gone so wrong. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw something in his face that I had never seen there before. Not anger, not hatred, not even fear. It was understanding. For the first time in our entire relationship, David Harrison looked at me and saw who I really was. Not the submissive wife he thought he had married, not the poor immigrant girl who should be grateful for his attention, but a woman who had outthought him, outplanned him, and ultimately outplayed him at a game he did not even know he was playing. Then the bailiffs led him away, their hands firm on his arms, and I watched him walk through the door at the side of the courtroom, watched it close behind him with a solid thunk that seemed to echo in the silent room. I never saw him again after that moment, though I sometimes wondered if he thought about me in his prison cell, if he lay awake at night trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong, how the woman he had dismissed as insignificant had turned out to be his undoing. The divorce had been finalized while David was in jail awaiting trial, signed and sealed and delivered with the same efficiency that had characterized all of Jonathan's work on my behalf. David had not contested it, probably on the advice of his lawyers who knew that fighting me would only make his situation worse, that any attempt to argue for a share of assets would only draw more attention to the fact that those assets had always been mine. The final decree was just a piece of paper, a few pages of legal language that reduced 3 years of marriage to a list of properties and accounts, and a declaration that the union was dissolved. I had gotten everything I was entitled to, which was exactly what I had brought into the marriage. The house, with its view of the garden I had planted, the company with its thousands of employees and its offices in 4 countries, the accounts and investments and properties that had always belonged to me, that David had never known existed because he had never bothered to ask about them, never thought to wonder how his wife's family had money when he assumed we were poor. He had looked at my brown skin and my accented English and my grandmother's recipes and concluded that I had nothing worth knowing about. His assumptions had been his downfall. He walked away with nothing. Exactly as I had promised Jonathan he would on the day I first walked into his office and told him what I needed. Not a penny, not a property, not a single asset to show for 3 years of pretending to love me while stealing from my company. He walked into that marriage thinking he had found an easy mark, a naive immigrant girl who would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he threw her way. He walked out with nothing but a prison sentence and a lifetime of regret. Margaret's assets were seized as part of her sentence, used to partially repay the money she and David had stolen. Her house, the one she had lived in for 40 years, the one filled with all her precious antiques and artwork, was sold at auction. Her jewelry was sold too, including the pearl necklace she had been wearing the night she screamed at me that maids eat in the kitchen. A stranger bought it for a fraction of what David had paid for it with my money. I wondered if they knew its history, if they would care if they did. Her society friends had abandoned her, of course. The same women who had attended her dinner party and laughed about the naive Mexican girl were nowhere to be found when Margaret needed support. Her club memberships had been revoked. Her charity positions had been given to other people. The world she had built, the reputation she had guarded so carefully, had crumbled to dust. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. But as I stood at the window watching the sun go down, I felt something more complicated than triumph. Something that was part satisfaction, and part grief, and part relief, and part something else I could not quite name. My phone buzzed with a text from Jonathan. The final transfer has been processed. All recovered funds are now in the Vasquez Holdings accounts. We also received confirmation that the foundation paperwork has been approved. I smiled as I read the message. The foundation had been my idea, something I had thought about during the long months of the trial. I was going to use a portion of the recovered funds to create a scholarship program for immigrant women who wanted to start their own businesses. My grandmother had come to this country with nothing but her recipes and her determination. I wanted to help other women who had that same determination but lacked the resources to make their dreams come true. I was going to call it the Luna Foundation, after my grandmother's nickname, after the company that had owned the house where David thought he was lord and master. It seemed fitting. There was a knock at the door. I opened it to find my cousin Rosa standing in the hallway, holding a bottle of champagne and a brightly wrapped gift. "I thought we should celebrate," she said, pushing past me into the apartment. "The trial is over, the bad guys are in prison, and my favorite prima is finally free." I laughed as she popped the cork and poured 2 glasses, the champagne fizzing and spilling over the rims in her enthusiasm. Rosa had been my rock through all of this, the family member who had always believed in me, who had never doubted that I would prevail. "Open the gift," she insisted, pressing the wrapped box into my hands. "I found it at an antique store downtown. When I saw it, I knew it was meant for you." I unwrapped the paper carefully, and my breath caught in my throat when I saw what was inside. It was a ceramic plate, hand-painted with bright flowers and birds, almost identical to the one my grandmother had brought from Mexico, the one Margaret had smashed on the kitchen floor. "It is not the same," Rosa said softly, watching my face. "I know that. But when I saw it, it reminded me so much of Abuela's plate. I thought maybe it could be a new beginning. A fresh start. I held the plate in my hands, running my fingers over the painted flowers, feeling the weight of it, the history of it. It was not my grandmother's plate. Nothing could replace that. But it was beautiful. And it was mine. And it represented something important. A new chapter. A fresh start. A future that I could fill with whatever I wanted. Thank you, I said, hugging Rosa tightly. It is perfect. We spent the evening drinking champagne and talking about the future. Rosa wanted to know my plans now that the trial was over, now that I was free to do whatever I wanted with my life. I told her about the foundation, about the scholarship program, about my ideas for expanding my grandmother's company in new directions. And the house? Rosa asked. The one where all of this happened. What are you going to do with it? I had thought about this a lot during the trial. The house held so many memories, good and bad. It was the place where I had been humiliated and dismissed, where Margaret had screamed at me and David had pointed at the door. But it was also the house I had bought with my own money. The house my grandmother's company had paid for. The house that had always been mine even when I did not feel like I belonged there. I am going to live there, I said finally. But first, I am going to renovate it. I am going to tear out everything Margaret changed, everything she tried to erase. I am going to restore it to the way it was when I first bought it, and then I am going to make it truly mine. New colors, new furniture, new energy. A house that reflects who I am, not who they wanted me to be. Rosa nodded approvingly. And the kitchen? I smiled. The kitchen is going to be the heart of it. I am going to design it around my grandmother's recipes, around the cooking that Margaret tried to make me ashamed of. There will be a proper molcachette station and a place for making fresh tortillas and a big table where I can host dinners for my friends and family. Rosa raised her glass. Tu abuela, she said, who taught us both that strength does not always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like waiting for the right moment. To abuela, I agreed, clinking my glass against hers, and to fresh starts. After Rosa left, I sat alone in my grandmother's apartment, the ceramic plate resting in my lap, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. David was in prison, where he would spend the next 12 years paying for his crimes. Margaret was there too, stripped of everything she valued, forced to confront the consequences of her cruelty and greed. Cynthia Wells had moved to another city, trying to rebuild her life after testifying against the man she thought she loved. And I was here, in my grandmother's apartment, surrounded by her things, preparing to write the next chapter of my story. I thought about the woman I had been 6 months ago, the woman who had stood in that kitchen with mole sauce splattered at her feet, crying tears of shock and grief as her world fell apart around her. I had been so broken then, so convinced that they had won, that they had finally succeeded in destroying me. But they had not destroyed me. They had freed me. By treating me as worthless, they had forced me to remember my own worth. By trying to erase my identity, they had made me fight to reclaim it. By underestimating me, they had given me the element of a surprise that allowed me to defeat them completely. I owed them my victory, in a strange way. If David had been kind, if Margaret had been accepting, I might have spent the rest of my life as the person they wanted me to be, invisible, grateful, small. Instead, I was exactly who my grandmother had raised me to be, strong, patient, fierce, a woman who could wait in the shadows until the time was right and then strike with devastating precision. The next morning, I went to visit the house for the first time since the trial ended. The renovation crew was meeting me there to discuss the plans, and I wanted to walk through the rooms one more time before the work began. The house was empty now, stripped of everything Margaret had brought, everything she had tried to use to erase my presence. The walls were bare, the floors uncovered, the rooms echoing with the sound of my footsteps. It felt like a fresh canvas, waiting to be painted. I walked into the kitchen and stood in the spot where I had stood that terrible night, looking down at the tiles where my grandmother's mole had stained the grout. The stain was still there, faint but visible, a permanent reminder of what had happened. For a long moment, I considered asking the crew to replace the tiles, to erase that last trace of the night that had changed everything. But then I changed my mind. No, I decided. The stain would stay. It would be a reminder, a warning, a testament. A reminder of where I had been and how far I had come. A warning to anyone who might try to treat me that way again. A testament to the truth that some things cannot be erased, that some wounds leave scars, and that those scars can become sources of strength. I would build my new kitchen around that stain, incorporating it into the design like the Japanese practice of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold to make the damaged part of the object's beauty. My kitchen would be beautiful and functional and filled with love, and at its heart would be this reminder of the night I found my strength. The renovation took 3 months. When it was finished, the house was transformed. Gone were the heavy drapes Margaret had hung, replaced by light curtains that caught the morning sun. Gone were her oppressive furniture and her cold color scheme, replaced by warm woods and bright colors and art that made me smile every time I looked at it. The kitchen was my masterpiece. I had worked with a designer who understood what I wanted, who helped me create a space that honored my heritage while embracing my future. There was a traditional molcajete station with a window above it that looked out onto the garden, where I could grind spices while watching the flowers grow. There was a professional range and a walk-in pantry stocked with ingredients for all of my grandmother's recipes. And in the center of it all, a large wooden table where I could host the dinners I had always dreamed of, surrounded by people who loved and respected me. On the wall above the table, I hung the ceramic plate Rosa had given me. It was not the same as my grandmother's plate, the one Margaret had destroyed, but it was beautiful and meaningful. And it reminded me every day of where I had come from and who I was. The first dinner I hosted in my new kitchen was for Rosa and Jonathan and a few close friends, people who had supported me through the darkest times. I made my grandmother's mole negro, the recipe that Margaret had tried to make me ashamed of, and served it on the new china I had bought to replace the set David had thought belonged to him. As I watched my friends eating and laughing around my table, I felt a peace I had not felt in years. This was what I had fought for. This was what I had won. Not just the house or the money or the victory over David and Margaret, but this. A life filled with people who loved me, with food that connected me to my heritage, with a home that was truly mine in every way that mattered. After dinner, I stood alone in the kitchen, washing dishes at the sink by hand because that was how my grandmother had always done it. The window above the sink looked out onto the garden, where I had planted new roses and dahlias to replace the ones Margaret had ripped out. They were blooming now, bright red and orange against the green, a reminder that some things can be destroyed, but life always finds a way to grow back. I dried my hands and walked to the spot on the floor where the mole stain was still visible, faint but present, worked into the design of the new tiles like a secret message that only I could read. I knelt down and traced the mark with my finger, remembering the crash of the plate, the triumphant sneer on Margaret's face, the empty look in David's eyes as he pointed at the door. "Maids eat in the kitchen," she had said. I smiled as I stood up, looking around at the beautiful kitchen I had created, the home I had built, the life I had reclaimed. "No, Margaret," I whispered to the empty room. "Queens eat wherever they want, and this queen is eating at the head of her own table, in her own house, surrounded by her own people." I walked out of the kitchen and through the house, turning off lights as I went, until I reached the front door. I paused there for a moment, looking back at the home I had fought for, the life I had won. Then I stepped outside into the cool evening air, closed the door behind me, and smiled. The past was behind me now. The future stretched out before me, full of possibility and promise, and I was finally, completely, irrevocably free. I had survived their cruelty. I had outlasted their schemes. I had turned their own weapons against them and emerged victorious. They had called me a maid. Now I was a queen. And this was just the beginning.